Good afternoon. Welcome again to the lecture series in the American Presidency class. We are now at Module 5. Module 5 deals with the president's relationship with the media and also with the mass public. We should also note that there are strategic relationships going in both directions. Presidents seek certain advantages through the media. The media seeks certain advantages from the president, and they both engage in strategic behavior in order to achieve their respective goals. This is a pretty long lecture, and so without further ado, let me go ahead and share the screen with this lecture and get started. Okay, so as you can see, this lecture concerns the president and the media. The relationship between the president and the media, as I mentioned a second ago, can best be evaluated in terms of a game that occurs between the president and the media. In order to understand this game, we need to understand the interests of the president and the media in engaging in their respective interactions. The president has both long and short-term goals. He wants three things: favorable approval, policy favorability, and to establish a historical legacy. In contrast, the media wants information on the presidency. It's not willing to pay very much in order to obtain that information. And then also the media wants favorable ratings by the editors and also more generally by the public. We'll talk about why a bit later. Demand for readers and editors tends the media to focus on the negative rather than the positive, as we'll see later. The president tends to be highly informed, or at least his staff is highly informed about what types of information it is willing to let the media have. The presidency is generally, but not fully, in control of what the media wants, and that is information. The media has something the president wants, specifically control over an instrument that can gain him presidential approval, and also facilitate the policy goals of the president, as well as help to establish the president's historical legacy. The relation, therefore, is strategic, in that both actors have something that the other wants. And so a sort of a bargaining occurs to produce the results that we see between the president and the mass media. Again, the president wants a sense from the media of what is going on in the world. He wants the pulse of the public and a feeler for important topics, and the media can give the president this. He wants the media to convey the president's messages to other political leaders, both at home and abroad. The media is needed to help in communicating with the mass public so that the president can secure public approval. The president wants visibility above and beyond that of other political leaders. The media provide the public with most of what they know about the president and the presidency. Without the media, as a citizen, we would know virtually nothing about the conduct of the presidency, such as was occurring in the 18th and 19th century. So the modern media is the principal intermediary between the president and the mass public. Many recent presidents have read newspapers and listened to the mass media in order to know what was said from and about them. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal are important sources of the news. They lead in the news lines. Kennedy, Johnson, and Reagan were avid television watchers. Johnson was almost paranoid about the news, and he reputedly had 3 TVs in the Oval Office so that he could watch all 3 network news newscasts at once. Johnson also had teletypes in the White House so he could watch the wire service releases. The wire services tend to precede all other media outlets in their reporting. Interestingly, Ronald Reagan liked Westerns, caring a lot less about the news and what the media was saying about him. Of course, in recent history, Trump watched Fox News, as we all know, religiously, and even based many of his decisions on Fox News commentaries. So relations with the press are an important part of the president's efforts to lead the public. Because of the great importance of the press to the president, the White House has historically gone to great lengths in order to encourage the media to project a positive image. Presidents and their staff coordinate the news. They hold press conferences, they hold formal briefings, interviews, photo opportunities, background sessions. They provide travel accommodations and also give the press daily handouts. In doing these things, the presidency is highly strategic in manipulating information for release to the media and how the media will be receiving information. However, the presidency cannot be fully in control of information or in the media's interpretation of information. As we're going to look at later, the president can't control leaks, nor can the president control what the media reports. So-called yellow journalism has been a facet of media coverage at least since Teddy Roosevelt. The media filters what is written and said about the president and the administration based on things like journalistic values and demand from their viewers. The media is not just a parrot of what the president says, but is an important independent actor in its own right. Of course, the First Amendment is important in these relationships. First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Of course, the important part of the First Amendment is freedom of the press. And however, from the beginning, American presidents and government has attempted to place restrictions on the press. In 1798, Congress passed legislation called the Aliens and Sedition Acts. The John Adams administration jailed many Democratic, Republican, partisan news editors and others for public opposition to the quasi-war with France. He viewed the opposition of the partisan media as disloyalty. Interestingly, also later, Congress passed the Espionage Act of 1917. The Wilson administration imprisoned and prosecuted Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs for making statements considered disloyal to the World War I effort. More recently, Edward Snowden and Julian Assange were indicted under this law. Also, Bradley Manning was convicted under this law. And so this law continues to be important in relationships in American society. Congress passed the Sedition Act of 1918, which forbids spoken or printed criticism of the US government, the constitution of the flag, but that law was repealed in 1920. In 1941, Franklin Roosevelt pardoned those convicted earlier under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. However, Congress also authorized at the same time Roosevelt to create an office of censorship during World War II. There's a plethora of court cases dealing with free press, and I would encourage you to visit the link that I have shown in this part of the slide. So let's talk about the history of media coverage of the presidency and of the media itself. In the founding era, most media coverage occurred through the print media. There was no electronic media at that time. Between 1790, 1 year after the start of the George Washington administration, and 1808, the number of newspapers in the United States grew from 92 to 329. Of those, all but 56 identified themselves with one or the other of the political parties. Recall that in this era, you had two political parties, one called the Federalists, the others called the Democratic Republicans. As you can see from these facts, partisan media is not new. Printed pamphlets in this era were also an important means of communicating with the public in the founding era. Between 1860 and 1920, new technological innovations permanently altered the press in the US. The development of the electronic printing press, the telegraph, the typewriter, telephone, linotype, wood pulp paper. And so as a result of these innovations, newspapers grew in importance and electronic media increased the rate at which information could be transmitted to the public. At the same time this was occurring, the public became increasingly literate. More people went to school. With these developments, the presidency was no longer such an isolated institution as had existed in the early part of the 19th century, as well as the latter part of the 18th century. Innovations in the media accelerated in the 1950s with television. In the 1980s, with cable news networks, things changed again. And in the 1990s, the internet comes along. Now, currently, it is very easy to get news on the presidency, and coverage on the presidency is sometimes around the clock on important issues. The press always has subjected the president to criticism from the George Washington administration onwards. George Washington said the calumnies against his administration were outrages of common decency, motivated by the desire to destroy confidence in the new government. John Adams was so upset with the press that he supported the Alien and Sedition Acts. He actually jailed many journalists under its authority. Of course, Adams' wife, Abigail Adams, was very upset at the personal attacks on John, including references to his rotundity and references to his bald head. This became a campaign issue in 1800. That is, the Alien and Sedition Acts became a campaign issue in 1800. Jefferson later pardoned those convicted under the Alien and Sedition Acts, and those acts were repealed during the Jefferson administration. One could argue that the press brought down the Johnson presidency with its reporting on Vietnam. Remember the Pentagon Papers, as well as the Nixon presidency through the relentless journalism of Woodward and Bernstein and the leaker Deep Throat. The Reagan presidency was treated, relatively speaking, with kid gloves by the press until the Iran-Contra scandal broke, after which the gloves came off in the relationship between Reagan and the press. Some have argued that his early easy treatment by the press was that he was actually a member of the press in an earlier career. However, his vulnerability showed through with Iran-Contra, and of course the sharks circled and pounced on Reagan in the last 2 years of his presidency. George H.W. Bush was not happy with the media's portrayal of him as an elitist and a bumbler. You guys are probably not old enough to remember the news occurrences, but he got sick and vomited in the presence of the Emperor of Japan. He stumbled off an aircraft, which made big time news. And then also there was a grocery store scanner incident during the 1992 presidential election, in which he and Barbara were depicted in a grocery store and had never seen a grocery store scanner. Of course, the implication is that that he wasn't a regular shopper. Somebody else did it for him. Of course, the Clinton administration was very unhappy with its initial treatment during his campaign and after. There were personal allegations of corruption that had no basis and did not deal with the issues in the campaign. Initially, Clinton did not have insiders dealing with his press coverage, but rather he brought on board campaign advocates after he hired David Gergen. He did better. Of course, you guys probably don't know this, but David Gergen is still around. He's a commentator on cable news, but he had also been Reagan's press secretary. So he was press secretary to two different presidents, one Republican and one Democratic. Relatively speaking, George W. Bush, the son, got a good holiday from the press, especially after 9/11. Very little negative coverage occurred of George W. During the 2000 election campaign and up until the Iraq invasion. However, with the 2004 election year and after that, the relationship of the president with the press was altered considerably as the news media picked up on problems with his administration and also skepticism about the war in Iraq. Obama was treated reasonably well during his first 100 days, as you're going to see a bit later with some data. However, after that, the media turned negative on Obama. And again, we're going to see some data on that later. And of course, Donald J. Trump had a continuous war with the media. He described what had always been considered mainstream media, that is the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, and so forth, as purveyors of fake news. And he depicted Fox News as authoritative and even used Fox News for his own decision making. According to Pew Research, during his first 100 days, Biden was covered slightly more negatively than positively by the news media generally, but the right-wing media was particularly critical of Biden. And I've got a hot link here that gives the data for this. And this is from a website dealing with journalism.org. And so I encourage you to visit that link. There is an organization called the Center for Media and Politics. It is nonpartisan and it conducts or reports studies of how presidents and candidates have fared with the mainstream media. I've got their hot link there, but we're going to go there in more specifics in a moment. For example, to see how various candidates in prior elections fared with the press, you might look at this study of the 2004 election, which was conducted by the Center for Media and Politics, or to see how Obama fared with the press after the 2008 election. You might check out the link, the next link, or the second link there that gives a comparative perspective, comparing Obama's coverage to previous presidents. Trump, of course, was the object of many jokes in late night television. And I've got a link here from the Center for Media and Politics that categorizes and lists the jokes that were made by late night television and other sources about Trump. There's another organization called MediaMatters.org. They have a slightly more liberal twist. They're not raving liberal, but they're somewhat liberal. They track Trump's war on the press from his inauguration on, and I've got a hot link there to the war on the press by the Trump administration shown here. I encourage you to visit that one. Media Matters also reports stories on current matters of interest, and you can see some of those at the hot link that I've got here. So the media is particularly interested in reporting a scandal. They'd like to focus on negative news because negative news sells much more readily than positive news does. They are so much interested in scandal that they sometimes rush with a story that might become a scandal without first confirming the facts. For example, consider the controversy over Hillary Clinton's use of a personal email account. Here's a report from Media Matters that points out that CNN had to update sloppy reporting on Clinton's alleged abuse of personal email. I can tell you from personal experience that when I've been quoted in the media, they almost get something wrong about what I have told them. And so, given that, you probably need to take the media reporting with a bit of a grain of salt. Okay, so who regularly covers the White House? Newspapers such as Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the weekly news magazines like Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, the wire services like Associated Press, United Press International, Reuters, Agence France Presse, newspaper chains like Hearst, Scripps Howard, Newhouse, Knight Ridder, television and news networks like ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN. There are more than 1,700 people who have White House press credentials. However, fewer than 70 reporters and 15 photographers regularly cover the White House. Most newspapers have no regular Washington correspondent. And you can see the White House Press Corps at the link that I've got here for Wikipedia. A few political scientists, interestingly, are also allowed in the press room, most notably Martha Joint Kumar, who has written extensively on relationships between the president and the press, who is a faculty also at Towson University. The presidential press operation, about 1/3 of the high-level White House staff is directly involved in relationships with the media and presidential policy of one type or another. Most staff members are involved at one time or another in cultivating the media's portrayal of the president. The White House press secretary is the person most often dealt with. I've got a hot link there to an article on the White House press secretary to get more than the tidbits that I'm going to give you here. The press secretaries are responsible for two-way interactions from the president to the media and from the media to the president. They are conduits of information from the White House to the press. They make public policy statements for the president. They issue White House press releases. They are responsible for making sure that the president's policies and positions are clear, or for that matter, trying to obfuscate, making them unclear under some circumstances. They also hold private meetings with reporters. The credibility of the press secretary rests on two important factors. One, telling the truth, and two, access to the president. For example, Clinton's first press secretary, Dee Dee Myers, was perceived as not being very close to the president's inner circle. Because of that, she didn't last very long, just a few months. How about Trump's press secretaries? His first one was Sean Spicer. What happened to Spicer? He had credibility issues. He was the butt of late night talk show jokes. Why? Because his statements were not very believable. Spicer was followed by Sarah Sanders and Stephanie Grisham. And then Trump's last press secretary was Kayleigh McEnany. After Grisham, Trump had basically ceased operating the press office. And so McEnany made her first press briefing in 417 days after the start of her tenure, and then only rarely and intermittently held a press briefing. You can see, especially the hot link I've got here, about how the daily press briefing basically died from 2018 on. The Trump White House curtailed daily press briefings, such as had been the practice since 1995. And I've got a hot link there for that. Invite you to visit those. Who is Biden's press secretary? Well, it's Jen Psaki. Relationships have returned to normal with about daily press briefings, sometimes more, sometimes less. And you can, let's go to this hot link here. You can see the press briefings by clicking this link here. And let's get those up here if they come fast enough. So here's a White House link to the president's daily press briefing. And you can see, you can actually read those press briefings here. Here's one on August 6th by Jen Psaki. And hi, everyone. Happy Friday. Okay, a couple of items for you at the top. You know, he got some bling on his finger, blah, blah, blah. And so there's a lot of banter and back and forth between Psaki and the press. Okay, so those are kind of fun to look at. Psaki has said that she will only serve until next year as press secretary. So it'll be interesting to see who Biden chooses next. Press secretaries also serve as conduits from the press to the president. They transmit needs from the press. Press secretaries are typically not involved in substantive decision making, but sometimes they are asked for advice on what information should be released, who should release it, in what form, and to what audience. The Office of the Press Secretary deals with the daily press needs of the president and manages their relationship with the news and media. Most notably, the press secretary conducts the daily briefings. In contrast, the Office of Communications deals with the big picture. They deal with strategic planning of how the president's statements will be released to the public. The leader of this office must be stable and usually serves a relatively long period of time. The director of the Office of Communications, again, separate from the press secretary, is currently Kate Bedingfield. She works closely with the press secretary to coordinate the flow of news from the entire executive branch, also to develop a long-term news management plan for the president. And also the communications office works on major speeches for the president, such as the president's State of the Union or the president's annual economic address, et cetera, et cetera. Modern presidents have also employed a weekly address, usually on Saturday, to the American people. This started during the Franklin Roosevelt administration and it was used by presidents sporadically after that. During the Roosevelt administration, it was conducted by radio. They were called fireside chats. Since Ronald Reagan, they have been used regularly. Reagan, through the second Bush, used radio. The second Bush used podcasts. Obama used YouTube video and podcasts. Trump used YouTube, but he didn't do this weekly. And you can see the last address by Trump by going to the link that I've got here. As with the daily press briefings, Trump ceased giving weekly addresses to the American people in 2018. President Biden has revived the historical practice of giving a weekly address to the American people, and these are available again on YouTube. And for example, you can see the latest as of the time I'm giving this lecture at the hot link that I've got there to give you a flavor for what they look like. Presidential press conferences, these are opportunities for the president to engage in a direct interaction between the presidency and the media's representatives. With the advent of television, these were also direct interactions between the president and the public. Why? The TV reached the mass public at large, while earlier eras were pretty obscure in reaching the mass public. Truman through Reagan in their press conferences generally used a large room. In 1982, Reagan started holding mock news conferences. Why did he do that? Reagan was known for his gaffes, and he wanted to be well prepared for news conferences. Presidents have frequently started their news conferences with a carefully prepared open statement. This was an attempt by the president to control the agenda of the news conference and also to use the media for their own purposes, to propagandize, if you will, through those opening statements. Clinton had a practice of granting time to the local media, in effect, bypassing the national media. Through these opening statements, presidents tried to jump over the reporters, going directly to the people. Recently, the television networks have diminished their coverage of news conferences because they don't have the ability to control the agenda. News conferences were seen as political tools of the president rather than giving an advantage for the media. Recent presidents have therefore used fewer formal news conferences. The frequency has varied through time from about 7 a month during Roosevelt to about 1 every 2 months during Nixon and Reagan. Bush 1 broke with tradition and held instead brief informal sessions with reporters, often called on short notice, so that he would have the advantage relative to the reporters. Clinton had a very antagonistic view of the press and did not hold his first press conference for 2 months and until 5 months before he held one in primetime viewing hours. And of course, this was after he had hired David Gergen. So in your textbook, you can get a sense of how often different presidents have used news conferences. Here's some data. First 200 days, presidents' solo press conferences. Trump held 1 in his first 200 days. Obama 9, Bush 3, Clinton 8, George H.W. Bush 18, Reagan 3, Carter 13, Ford 8, Nixon 6, Johnson 19, Kennedy 14, Eisenhower 14. So in the first 200 days, you can see that some presidents held a whole lot of news conferences. Some presidents held very few. Joe Biden has held 4 so far in his first year. So he's low, but he's increasing. See also the data shown at the presidency Santa Barbara website. You can see statistical data on presidential news conferences there. Donald Trump, as I said just now, only had 1 press conference in his first year. That broke a very long tradition However, he held 35 during his last year. Why? The pandemic. He held 35 news conferences dealing with the pandemic during his final year. Starting in March of 2020, Trump started holding regular briefings on the coronavirus. These were sessions in which he regularly told citizens how well the fight was going and how great a job his administration was doing in combating the pandemic. He also recommended the use of hydroxychloroquine in fighting the virus, a recommendation that was significantly disavowed by the medical community. Trump's frequent briefings were suddenly stopped after he suggested on April 23rd of 2020 that coronavirus could be stopped by ingesting disinfectant. And you can see the president's remarks where he made this statement by clicking the hot link that I've got there. Other services for the press. The White House press secretary and Office of Communication, they hold background discussions with reporters for policy initiatives. This is commonly called a briefing. Briefings give information on anything current, from policy initiatives to family pets to the president's health. This gives the press lines on the president's mood and ideas. And the American Presidency Project, that is the project at the University of California, Santa Barbara, provides data on those briefings. And you can go to the hot links that I've got listed there to see the data on presidential briefings. These are done again by the press secretary and the Office of Communications. Interviews with the president or top White House officials are something that is valued. Sometimes the White House uses these for its own purposes. Again, it's part of the strategic game, such that presidents have regularly cultivated elite reporters and columnists trying to turn them to their own purposes. Other things that the press corps, that the White House does, they provide transcripts of briefings, early release of presidential speeches, daily handouts, including information about the president and his policies, advance notice of travel plans, notice of upcoming stories, major announcements. They arrange transportation and lodging for the press on trips, and they also provide technical support. This includes installing permanent equipment in the White House, obtaining telephones for reporters, obtaining platforms for photographers, and so forth. So the press is very dependent on the support of the White House in several ways. One is for information, and two is technical support for what the press corps does. So the press needs information, and the best place to get it is the White House. However, in this regard, the press operates in a very much controlled environment. The White House manipulates the subject matter, the timing of releases, the wording of releases, and tries to manipulate the media to its own advantages. Let's flip the relation. We've been talking about the press, the White House's relationship with the press. Let's flip it and talk about the media's relationship with the presidency. As we talked about earlier, the media is an independent actor in the American system, and we noted that the First Amendment and the norms of the media profession are important in making the media an independent actor. One important norm of the media profession is objectivity. Reporters who are biased in their coverage rarely achieve prominence, except, of course, for the partisan media outlets like Fox News or MSNBC. In order to work at Fox News or MSNBC, you must be either conservative in the case of Fox News or liberal in the case of MSNBC, although there are some who are more neutral at both of those organizations. Another important norm is to verify sources for stories. A single source is usually not enough. It has to be verified. by multiple sources. Yet another norm is the confidentiality of sources. Reporters tend to view mid-level aides to the president as the best source of information on the presidency because they have in-depth knowledge and are free from the constraints of high visibility. Leaks are an important phenomenon in media coverage of the presidency. The White House would like to control the flow of information, but usually they can't do that fully. Reporters vigorously protect the identity of their spokespersons, that is, the leakers. For example, witness the melee over who leaked the identity of an undercover CIA agent. Her name was Valerie Plame, and retaliation for exposing intelligence on the transfer of nuclear technology to Iraq. This was associated with President George W. Bush's State of the Union address, who cited the faulty intelligence. The easy solution for this for the administration would have been to simply ask the 6 reporters who exposed the information. However, they wouldn't give up the name, claiming First Amendment privilege without extreme coercion. Who leaks information? Everyone. David Stockman, who was Reagan's director of the Office of Management and Budget, released information on Reagan's willingness to compromise on the 1981 tax bill. Oliver North leaked information on the Achille Lauro hijackers in the early 1980s. Clinton's image of dishonesty flowed out of the continual leaks from Ken Starr's supposedly neutral Office of Special Whitewater Prosecutor. These were leaks that were virtually all unsubstantiated. No one ever knew the source of the leaks because of the norm of confidentiality. Similarly, someone in Bush's White House leaked the identity of the undercover CIA operative to at least 6 reporters, apparently in retaliation for exposing weak intelligence relating to the president's State of the Union message. Scooter Libby, who was the press secretary for Dick Cheney, went to jail over this leak. They finally got to the root of who did the leaking, and it was Cheney's press secretary who did the leaking. This, of course, was a violation of U.S. law. It is against the law to out a security operative. Obviously, the Trump White House was probably the leakiest of all among presidents, with frequent leaks sending the media into a frenzy over issue after issue after issue. It started with leaked phone call conversations with foreign leaders, leaked internal discussions, leaked personal information. I've got a hot link here to some of the major leaks that occurred in the first year of the Trump presidency. This all spurred Justice Department efforts to stop the leaks. Leaks continued, as you'll see at the hot link that I've got here. So far, the Biden White House has had a paucity of leaks, and here's an opinion article on why there have been very few leaks from the Biden administration. Basically, what it says is that Biden is more mature and is more stable, and it alludes to the idea that Trump himself was responsible for many of the leaks that occurred through his Twitter account. Sometimes leaks are inadvertent. Other times they are actually deliberate to bolster or damage the administration on particular policy matters. Not all in government favor the president's position, and so they may become leakers. Other times they are deliberate to gain strategic policy advantages or to misinform. Leaks can have a lot of different purposes, depending on who is doing the leaking, the president's friends or the president's enemies. On the friends side, there can be trial balloons. The leak is sent out, the reaction is assessed, and then the president and his staff may act or not act based on the trial balloons. Another reason for a leak might be to get favorable reporting on a particular policy, or the president might want to send signals to foreign nations, or the president may want to be able to disavow something. So a leak occurs and then the president immediately disavows that leak, or personnel matters may lead to a leak in order for the president to get a resignation. This occurred, of course, during the Reagan administration, as the president sought to get rid of his director of the EPA, Ann Gorsuch Burford. This matter is reported in my 1993 book on the EPA and the war at the EPA against the Reagan administration. Or it could be something intended to force the president's hand on foreign policy matters, to get the president to actually act, or maybe even on domestic matters. For example, you may or may not recall the leak of the president being willing to not have the policy of gays in the military, where the Vice President Biden actually came out in front of President Obama in the gays in the military matter. Depending on the media type, there is an air of superficiality to media coverage of the president. Newspapers tend to be more in-depth and less superficial than the visual media. Organizational imperatives from the media are to get information, any information at all, on the president, and that is given. That is a given due to organizational imperatives. Most media coverage on the presidency is superficial, characterized by brevity and simplicity. In particular, since the 30-minute newscast is the source of many people's news, about a 3-minute spot is the most that can occur for any one story. And of course, that severely limits information transmission. Another reason for the superficiality is that there's really little new under the sun. The presidency is still the presidency, and once the uniqueness of a new presidency is worn off, then there's often very little new to report. Yet another reason for the superficiality of media coverage of the presidency is the limited training and lack of specialization of the White House press corps. They often don't know much about politics, the Constitution, or the issues in democracy, and so they focus on politics in the infighting sense, as well as personalities, rather than the important issues of substantive policy concern. With the print media, despite the glamour of investigative reporting, such as with Woodward and Bernstein, the Washington Post, and Watergate, very little is done. It takes too much time. It is too uncertain of a payoff to a reporter. Occasionally, you see a story with some potential payoff, but the risks are great for devoting a lot of resources to a story, such as the leak on the undercover CIA operative that we talked about earlier. So in the media, the emphasis is on short run, emphasis on trivia rather than important substantive policy matters. In other words, who cares whether Clinton had an affair? It's a silly thing to be focusing on. Media should have been focusing on substantive policy concerns. Similarly with the Trump administration, who cares about a lot of the minor things that were reported by the media associated with the Trump administration? Does the press show a systematic bias for or against particular presidents? There is currently a lively academic debate over that question. And you can see the literature review on this at the Wikipedia entry that I've got hot linked there as to whether or not there is a media bias. A major problem in many studies is something called confirmation bias. Research into studies of media bias show that liberal experimenters tend to get results that say the media has a conservative bias, while conservative experimenters tend to get results that say the media has a liberal bias. And those who do not identify themselves as either liberal or conservative get results indicating little bias or mixed bias. So confirmation bias, I've got the definition hot linked there, and you should read a little bit more about that. Although journalists are often accused of having a liberal bias, their real bias is a preference for the negative. The press prefers to frame the news in negative themes. Once a theme is established, it's hard for a president to shed. Ford was depicted by the media as a bumbler, Carter as a weak, indecisive leader, Vice President Dan Quayle as an ignoramus. He certainly was not. Ronald Reagan as a great symbolic leader. Bush 1 as a waffler on no new taxes. Clinton as caring about people, but also dishonest and a womanizer. Bush 2 as illiterate. Obama as a typical liberal elite, and Trump as question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark. And finally, Biden as forgetful and old. Again, presidents have a lot of difficulty shedding these themes that appear repeatedly in the mass media. Is the media effective in influencing the president's approval ratings? Most studies have found little or no relationship between media coverage of the president, positive versus negative, and the president's public approval ratings. Why not? The media affect perceptions rather than attitudes. The public's familiarity with political matters is closely related to the amount of time they're exposed to media coverage. So the media is an agenda setter. People readily adopt the media's perception of what issues are important. While the question of what issues are important is determined by the media, the question of how to feel about those issues is determined more by people's partisanship and their political values. Why should media bias be limited? Again, we talked earlier about the norm of objectivity. At some organizations, reporters tend not to be from one political party, so that while one reporter may be biased, there may be others in the other direction. Also, rotating assignments produces more objective news coverage. Basically, both Democrats and Republicans fall under the critical eye of the mass media. There is growing evidence that network news help to provide a frame of reference for issues, and that this affects evaluations of the president. Iran-Contra coverage coincided with a dip in Reagan's approval ratings, and experiments found that, social science experiments found that President Carter's overall reputation and competency were affected by network news coverage. The press is good at producing images. For example, Carter's image as indecisive flowed out of press coverage of the Iran hostage crisis. Was the media biased against Trump, or were they just focusing on the negative? Harvard Shorenstein Center of Media, Politics, and Public Policy found the following about media coverage of Trump's first 100 days. For more details, you can go to the link I've got there. The findings of the Shorenstein study: Trump dominated media coverage in the outlets and programs analyzed, with Trump being the topic of 41% of all news stories. He was also the featured speaker in nearly 2/3 of his own coverage. This, of course, due to his tendency to be the chief tweeter. Republican voices accounted for 80% of what newsmakers said about the Trump presidency, compared to only 6% for Democratic voices and 3% for those involved in anti-Trump protests. European reporters were more likely than American journalists to directly question Trump's fitness for office. Again, this is during the first 100 days. There was not a single major topic where Trump's coverage on balance was more positive than negative, setting a new standard for unfavorable press coverage of a president. Fox News was the only news outlet in the study that came close to giving Trump positive coverage overall. However, there was even variation in the tone of Fox's coverage depending on the topic. Okay, here's a more detailed look at some of the findings. You can see at the top here, the top panel, you have Trump got 80% negative coverage and 20% positive. This compares with Obama, who got about 60% positive, or George W. Bush, who got 43% positive, or Clinton, who got 40% positive. And so you can see here that between the presidencies here, Trump fared worse and Obama fared best. But there's not a partisan bias here in the sense that Clinton got about the same coverage as George W. Bush. And so you can see that both Republicans and Democratic presidents receive both positive and negative coverage. In the bottom panel here, you can see the biases of the news outlets, the tone of the news coverage with regard to Trump. CNN was 93% negative, NBC 93% negative, CBS 91%, New York Times 87% negative, Washington Post 83% negative, Wall Street Journal 70% negative, and Fox 52% negative. And of course, we've got the European outlets here, which we're less concerned with. So was this a bias against Trump, or was this simply the media's propensity to focus on the negative? Okay, so let's stop the sharing and conclude. You can see here in this lecture that the relationship between the president and the media and the president is bidirectional. Each actor has something to gain, and they seek to produce gains. And you can see some specifics on how the media is treated by the White House, as well as how the media treats the White House. So in the next session, we'll talk about public opinion on the issues, as well as the president's public approval ratings. So without further ado, I will end this session, and we will continue with a subsequent lecture. Good afternoon, and I hope you have enjoyed this session. So let me